Hello, everybody. So I hope your study for Isaiah is going on very, very successfully. Today, I'm going to start on chapter 49, 50, and 51. Okay, let's talk about what is there in chapter 49. Isaiah chapter 49 is a very powerful message that focuses on the mission and calling of the servant of the Lord. Now, this chapter speaks about the restoration of Israel and the inclusion of all the other nations also in God's plan. Okay, let's understand. The key point starts with the servant's calling. Now, this chapter talks about that the servant of the Lord speaking about his calling. He was chosen by God even before he was born, and his mission is to bring Israel back to God. The servant is described as a very sharp sword and a polished arrow, symbolizing his power and purpose. This shows us that God has a plan for everyone even before we are born. Now, then they talk about the servant's mission. At first, the servant feels that his work is in vain, but God reassures him that his mission is not only to restore Israel, but also to be a light to the nations. This means that God's salvation is not just for Israel, but for all the people, right? The lesson here is that God's plans are often bigger than we can imagine. We think He's specifically working on for Israel, but no, He sent the Messiah for the entire world, isn't it? Now, God's promise of restoration, God is very, very strong and powerful, and He has made a strong promise to people. God promises that those who have been despised and rejected now will be honored. The Lord will lead and comfort His people, bringing them back from distant lands. This is a message of hope and reassurance that no matter how far we are from God, He is always ready to bring us back. Then the key point in this chapter is Zion's complaint and God's response to that. Now, Zion is representing Israel, correct? And it feels forgotten by God. It feels I'm forsaken by God. But God responds with a powerful promise, comparing his love for Israel to a mother's love for their child, unfailing and unforgettable. God assures that he will never forget his people and will gather them back to him. Then they talk about the expansion of Israel. God also promises that Israel, which felt barren and desolate, will be filled with people again. The nations will bring Israel's sons and daughters back, and the kings and queens will serve them. This shows that God will restore Israel to a place of very high honor and abundance. The chapter ends with God declaring that even though the situation may seem hopeless, he will still rescue his people from the powerful and the oppressors. God is portrayed as a mighty savior who fights for his people and will not let them be destroyed. Thus, Isaiah chapter 49 is a chapter filled with hope, assurance, and the promise of restoration. It teaches us about God's everlasting love, his plans for our lives, and his desire to bring salvation to everyone, not just a selected few Israelites. Now we'll talk about chapter 50. In Isaiah chapter 50, it's a chapter where God speaks directly to his people, explaining why they have suffered and reassuring them of his help. It also includes a powerful description of the suffering servant who faithfully obeys God even in the time of suffering. So, what are the key points? In chapter 50, God's explanation of Israel's suffering is elaborated. This chapter begins with God addressing Israel's complaint that they have been abandoned by them. This is what Israel is complaining. God asks if there was any reason for him to abandon them, like a certificate of divorce. He explains that their suffering was not because he left them, but because they turned away from God. This teaches us that when we feel distant from God, it's often because we have moved away, not because God has left us. All right. Second, the next part of the chapter describes a suffering servant who is obedient to God even in the difficult times. The servant speaks of how God gave him the ability to speak words of comfort and encouragement to those who are weary and tired. He listens to God every day. This suffering, faithful servant, he listens to God every day and does not turn away from God for what God has asked him to do. This highlights the importance of being obedient to God's call, even when it is very tough. The servant then describes the suffering he endures. He offers his back to those who beat him, the cheeks to those who pull it out his beard, and does not hide from insult and spitting. This shows the deep humility and commitment of the servant to God's mission. It reminds us that following God might involve challenges and suffering, but it's important to remain faithful. Now, despite all the suffering, the servant is confident that God will help him. He knows he will not be disgraced because God is with him. And the servant is so confident in God's support that he challenges anyone who accuses him to confront him, knowing that God will vindicate him. This teaches us about the importance of trusting in God, even when we have difficulties or opposition being faced. Now, it also ends with a contrast between those who trust in God and those who rely on their own light and wisdom. Those who trust in God, even in the darkness, will find light. But those who create their own light, ignoring God, will lie down in torment. This serves as a warning to always put our trust in God rather than relying solely on ourselves. So, Isaiah chapter 40 is a powerful message about obedience, trust, and the consequences of turning away from God. It encourages us to stay faithful even in tough times and reminds us that God is always ready to help us when we trust in Him. All right, now let's move to chapter 51. Now, what is chapter 51? Chapter 51 is all about a message of hope and encouragement to the people of Israel. So, first, they talk about looking to the past. In the beginning, God tells the people to look to the rock from which you were hewn. This means they should remember their ancestors like Abraham and Sarah, who were blessed by God. Even though they were few, God made them into such a big, great nation, isn't it? This reminds us that God can do great things even when we feel small or insignificant. God's promise to comfort Zion. Zion is which represents Jerusalem and God's people, correct? So God's promise to comfort Zion and make its wilderness like Eden, a beautiful garden. This is a promise that God will restore and bless his people, bringing joy and gladness. He also promises that his justice will be a light to the nations, showing that God's law and salvation are everlasting. The chapter encourages the people not to be afraid of human threats because, compared to God, they are temporary. They are all temporary. God's salvation and righteousness will always last forever, while human oppressors will fade away. This teaches us to trust in God's eternal power rather than fearing the temporary challenges we face. Then this chapter reminds the people that God, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, is in control. This shows God's great power and reassures the people that He can protect and save them. Towards the end, God speaks directly to Jerusalem, assuring them that He will take the cup of His anger away from them and give it to their enemies instead. Right? This means that God will stop punishing them and instead the enemies will face the consequences of their actions. How nice, right? Finally, God calls his people to awake and stand up. Awake and stand up. This is a call to action, encouraging them to rise with confidence because God is on their side. He has heard their cries and is ready to act on their behalf. All right. So this we complete chapter 49, 50, and 51. All the best. Please practice the MCQ questions after you have read the Bible. The link is given below. Thank you.